Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
Remember Tony the Tiger, the Pillsbury Doughboy, Ronald McDonald who bought you hamburgers, Coke, and a free toy in each children's Happy Meal? Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your co-host today along with Molly Painshaw. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Debbie Danowski, social science researcher in the field of big food advertising. Dr. Debbie Danowski is an expert on media literacy and food addiction. She holds a PhD in media education at Capella University and is an associate professor at Sacred Heart University, where she has researched and taught for over 25 years in the intersection of media, advertising, and problematic eating behaviors. Dr. Danowski's research and publications focus on the role of advertising and media in enabling food addiction and disordered eating patterns. She is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and most recently her 2023 book, Happy Eating and Food Addiction in American Advertising. Through her research, writing, speaking engagements, and public health advocacy, Dr. Danowski's goals are to spread understanding of how media and advertising can enable food addiction, as well as her goal is to reduce stigma around this disease and highlight evidence-based treatment approaches. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Before we start, tell us a little bit about your story, how you got into the food addiction area, and what specifically got you into big food advertising.
I come into the food addiction, and I've been in recovery for almost 35 years now. I went to a treatment center in 1989, which has since closed. And I found out that I was physically addicted, and I still continue to be, to sugar, flour, and certain other products. And I think once I found that out, after I, of course, got over the devastation and being locked up for 6 weeks and recovering and all that, a few years later when I started teaching, I became angry at the way that the commercials, I'd watch commercials and I'd become angry because it made me want the food. And if I ate that food, I know it was going to start a spiral of addiction. And so as I'd watch these commercials, I just didn't really know what to do about it or anything. But then as the years went on and I began to teach more in the media field, I started out in the journalism area and I moved in media studies. I started to realize that there's a lot of tricks out there that are happening that are making us want this food even more. And so these advertisements are worse than I ever thought they were. And I found out more and I learned more and I started to research. And even as part of my classes, I started to teach a food advertising class. I started to teach an alcohol advertising class. And I just started to learn about how dangerous these ads are. And I think that it's not really that well known how powerful they are because everybody thinks, oh, advertising doesn't affect me. I'm too smart for that. And maybe if we saw just one advertisement, that might be true. But yet some experts say that we see as many as 5,000 ads a day. That counts logos and things online and everything. And how can you compete with the power of that when you see that many food advertisements over and over? Eat this, do that, and all the tricky messages that are in there. It's dangerous. And I just got angry.
And so how did a book come out of that?
I had written a few articles for different peer-reviewed journals, and I started to look at what was going on. And it just, again, watching all these, I must have probably during the course of doing all this and since I started and continued to research in this area, I've probably seen, I would say close to 5,000 ads that I studied carefully, not just like in passing like everybody else. And the more I studied them and then the more I read, there are some good books out there. Ultra Processed People just came out by Chris Van Tulken. And that's very powerful about the tricks that are used in measuring your brain images to see when you react most to the ads. And I guess as I read books like this, many before that, I really just wanted to write my own thing because I didn't read anything about the ads. There was nobody studying eating disorder or food addiction behaviors in food advertising.
Can I ask something about that, Debbie? Because as you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about like me putting myself in your shoes and like this process, And I'm just wondering, how did you really study these advertisements, these marketing materials, whatever, without being activated yourself? I really want to know that part too, if we can talk a bit about that. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I'm just like, I got to get that in there. I have to know, how did you do that without being like, oh, panic?
I think in the beginning, I was worried about that. And there were times when I could see myself being drawn into the messages, and being a food addict, food always looks good to me. It just does. But I think because I was so angry, it helped me. And I kept in my mind that if I believed what they said, then eventually being addicted to this food, it would kill me if I ate it. And I stayed close to my support groups and did things that, helped me to stay in recovery. But there were times when I was triggered, and I remember thinking to myself, is this something you should really be doing? But I was so mad that I just kept going. Like, I just kept looking at it. It was almost like I was drawn to these ads to say, oh, look at that. Look at what they're saying here. I looked more at the messages than at the food itself.
When you said earlier about how people think, oh, I'm too smart for that, I'm not really affected. In the pharmaceutical industry, in the old days, I remember I would be invited to these extravagant meals. And I even went on a resort. This was in the HIV days, where they just amazingly generous to doctors because they wanted us to prescribe very expensive medications. And I remember thinking, I'm going to enjoy this free ride. And I know which meds I like and which ones I don't. Once you get like the spa treatment and the wine, the steak dinner, it's hard to say this person's my enemy once I'm eating their food. Yeah. Intellect is not as powerful as we think. The question I have is, when you thought I'd like to write this book, did you find a publisher that was like, yeah, what a great idea? How did you get a publisher to respond to that specific pitch?
I'm very lucky in that I chose a respected academic publisher. I don't believe I would have gotten this book published in a popular publisher because so many of them are owned by food companies or merged with food companies. And my editor just recognized that there was a lack of information about this. She recognized the importance of it, and she was very welcoming to the topic. But judging from the way that my journal articles, there were many times when I could tell that the idea of vilifying food advertisements and taking the Pillsbury Doughboy or Tony the Tiger and saying, look how dangerous they are, didn't go over well for some people. And I was used to it from my popular books that I published about food addiction. People don't like to look at the food that means so much to them, even people who are normal eaters. And I think the short answer is I just lucked out that she recognized that there is not any research in this area, or very little.
Okay, so let's talk about the book. The book is called Happy Eating and Food Addiction in American Advertising. And first of all, can you start with this term happy eating, what you mean by that, and why you picked that as your central theme?
Happy eating, there was experiments done many years ago with children and television violence, and they called it consequence-free violence or happy violence. And it was that when violence was shown on television, there were no consequences if it was like the hero who was creating that violence. And so they called it happy violence because there were no consequences shown on the program. And I thought that's exactly what advertisements are. It's happy eating. You watch people dancing around with their ice creams who are thin. Now, if you eat a lot of ice cream and you love it so much that you're going to dance around with it, you're not going to be thin. You're not going to be able to move around freely. Happy eating is really the idea that there are no consequences. You don't see what happens after you eat that food. You're urged, buy one, get one free. Yet what happens if you eat both of them? It's not shown.
That's actually a term, happy violence, that you took from happy eating?
Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
So in thinking about, like you said, so if you love your ice cream so much, you're dancing around, you're not going to be able to eat it. Like this idea of happy violence or happy eating and these consequences so they're not seeing it. So that essentially sets people up for disappointment. They're not telling the whole truth. I think about alcohol commercials. They're not showing people intoxicated, drinking and driving and killing somebody. Like, they're not doing any of that. As you were doing this research, can you talk a bit more about those tactics and techniques maybe that they use in the advertising world to really get at young people or whoever their market might be?
Sure.
Because that's really interesting. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes. That's a great question, because one of the most dangerous is probably one of the most well-loved. It's the use of mascots. We have,
think it was Tony the Tiger, right?
Tony the Tiger, right. He came around in 1951, and from the time that he was introduced, he was popular. He was this black and white character in the 50s, and they made sure that they associated him almost from the point they used him with sports activities, sporting activities. Tony was water skiing. Tony was watching rugby. Tony was doing all these things that were associated with physical activity. And then we get into the 60s and it continues. And at that point, they used Tony as they started like skiing and gymnastics and things like that. And sometimes the people were famous and well-known, like champions in those sports. 70s, they decided that they were going to show a little bit of Tony's family. You see the little baby tigers and the mom. And so this is the progression of how this mascot has moved into people's lives. And maybe when the grandparents were kids, they saw Tony in the 50s and then their kids saw them. So it's passed down. And then by the 80s and 90s, we have Tony telling children that they could do anything. You see these commercials where he gives the child a bowl of cereal and all of a sudden she's jumping in water skis over these giant things that probably only professional water skiers could do. And this was like all throughout the slogan was brings out the tiger in you. So if you eat this cereal, then you can bring out the tiger in you and do these amazing things. And that's the 80s and the 90s. And then we go into the 2000s and Tony's a celebrity by then. He's loved by everybody. He gets fan letters. He's real at this point. It took a little while, but they made him into this icon and then who actually goes and partners with professional athletes. So then in 2019, they launched this thing called Mission Tiger. And Mission Tiger, one of the commercials I mentioned in my book, it was done with Jalen Hurts, who's, I don't know about sports, but he's an Eagles quarterback. And so they go around and they're funding programs in middle schools. Now, think about that. Middle schools are chosen very deliberately because elementary schools don't really have that many programs. By high school, eating habits are established. Middle school students are still very vulnerable to having their eating habits established. And so they're funding these sports programs at schools, which looks like a wonderful thing. We're giving money so that kids can be active, but we're giving it based and tied to a sugar-filled cereal and a mascot who is really just designed to sell that cereal. He's not your friend. There were even some people who wrote about how Tony the tiger, like kids who don't have fathers, confuse him as a paternal figure. So we have this paternal figure promoting this cereal. And to me, that is just disgraceful that we're telling kids that they can eat this cereal and they can be active. And you can't. It's one or the other. You can't eat a lot of this cereal and still be successful in sports. And he's not alone. There's plenty of other mascots.
There are, but I think something that's really interesting about Tony the Tiger and you laying out that history is it establishes this trust and respect. And because it's been so long, like you said, it's generational. If maybe my kids see a commercial and it has to do with cereal and Tony the Tiger's on it because that same tiger was around when I was a kid, I might be more willing to trust that cereal or whatever, those foods, because I'm like, oh yeah, that was around when I was a kid. And then meanwhile, my parents are saying the same thing. And yes, like talk about like effective, insidious type, like getting in there. It's Smokey the Bear. Smokey the Bear has been around forever, right? Teaching us about forest fires. And here Kellogg's has teaching us to just, bring out the tiger in us, like you said, using sugar and whatever else goes in there. Sorry, Vera, I cut you off. Go ahead.
That's okay. I want you to answer, Debbie.
There wasn't really a question so much as it's just really interesting how you laid that out and how, I guess I've never even thought about how that progression can happen and how we can just really come to know and trust. And like you said, I remember the Wheaties box with like the Olympians on it or some major sports player or whatever it might be. So like these marketing things and again, they're not showing you those consequences. They're not showing you what people look like before they go to the Biggest Loser ranch, right? They're not putting those folks on the box and for very specific reasons, but those are the actual negative outcomes. They're just saying, trust this. Like people trusted the Marlboro Man for years too, right? And it turned out wasn't so good for us.
Right. That's right. And we have Poppin' Fresh, the Pillsbury Doughboy. He's been around for a long time too. I think it was 1965 he came around. Kids have been pushing his belly button for how many years now? You like it. He's fun to watch. But he also is promoting food that's ultra processed and unhealthy.
So the question that I was going to ask is to play the devil's advocate. Tony the Tiger is promoting bring out the tiger in you. And you can make the argument that, well, that's a good message. And yes, it's attached to food, but it's a great message for kids to hear where they might not otherwise hear it. And that's probably the rationale that they use. And like the Olympians, seeing that, like it does promote the possibility to children who would otherwise not think, oh, maybe I could become one of them.
Yeah, but those are also the kids who are most vulnerable, the ones who believe they can, who have the least amount of money to buy the ultra processed. And it's hard. It's easy to say, oh, it's parents' fault. And it's not. Parents are busy. The economy for eating healthy foods is stacked against them. So it's just cheaper, easier, and quicker to go and buy this food that hardly ever goes bad.
Yeah.
It's cheap and the kids love it. Of course they love it. It's designed to make them love it.
Let's go back then to since we're talking about kids, Tony the Tiger, it's targeted to, like you said, middle school. What about some of the other techniques that Big Food uses for kids, like the concept of play? Yeah. Think about the McDonald's has that big thing in the middle of their restaurant where people jump and I don't know what it is. It's some kind of a big balloon.
It's a playscape. Yes. But they also have Happy Meals. And think about that. Just the word, just the title, Happy Meals.
Yeah.
Like you eat this and you'll be happy. There's a toy inside. Now, what does a toy have to do with eating this food? So I think the idea originally was let's entice the kids to eat this food because then they'll eat more of it and they'll want the next toy. And it's always a toy that's part of a series. So you have to eat more. You have to keep going back every week to get the next one in the series. And it's really effective for kids. For the age group that it's targeted at, it's very effective. And we have animal crackers. Think about animal crackers. They're actually a toy. They're shaped like animals. There's a lot of things like that that are very subtle, if not in the product itself, then in the commercials. You watch these cartoony commercials. Fruit Roll-Ups has a great commercials with some kids and some cartoons and special effects mixed in and how they make these fruit leathers that are so processed that there's not even any fruit in it, really. They say real fruit because, yes, at one time it was, but by the time they got done with it, it has no nutritional value.
Yeah. And then like beyond even like kids and play, like sometimes it's the like relaxation and self-care. It's like, oh, you deserve a break today. Go get a Kit Kat, breaking off these Kit Kat pieces or whatever. And yeah, again, like a big problematic issue for people who are vulnerable to these messages.
And those are targeted more toward the adults who are so overwhelmed today. We started with you deserve a break today in 1971. And that's really like, that was McDonald's commercial. You deserve a break today. That was their adult target audience. You don't have to cook anymore. It's too much for you. Here, you deserve a break. Eat this food. Same thing. KFC very early on in the 50s started with let the Colonel cook for you tonight. And those are messages that really hit so many people then and now because we are busy. We are overwhelmed. The other side that we never see advertised is it doesn't take very much to open a bag of salad or to go into the grocery store and get even the beans that are pre-cut and steam them, put them in the microwave bag. It doesn't take a lot, but nobody's going to advertise that. They're going to instead try to get you to get the Dove ice cream bars. They were part of International Self-Care Day on July 24th, and they offered like Dove ice cream bars in with mini facials and meditation stones and things like that. And there was a limited amount, so they made it sound like it was this special thing. And still, self-care doesn't involve eating food that's not healthy for you.
That also makes me think of as Dove chocolates. When you open them, like the packages have like little, like wonderful sayings inside of them. Mm-hmm. Oh, like you're so great, or like some sort of like little like mantra or self-affirmation. And like another way that they're just like, oh, this is you doing a beautiful thing for yourself. And look at this little message that comes with this chocolate. It's crazy.
There's this another commercial where you see the woman in the bathtub and she's relaxing and she's eating, I think it's chocolate. And she's sitting there eating, and this is her way of taking care of herself, a bath. And I think it was, it might be a cookie. And it's like, that's the whole premise of this self-care relaxation theme is that this is something good you're doing for yourself. And it's not.
Now, a family doctor listening to you might say, okay, I can see the value of having a good metabolic profile, but come on, Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety, you can't really change that. Do you have any clinical experience to actually show that you were able to show either a halting or even a regression of some of those conditions?
Absolutely. Do I see it in everyone? Certainly not. Do I see really remarkable improvements in most patients? Yes. Do I see full recoveries in some patients, even some patients with serious mental illnesses? Yes. And in addition to my own clinical practice, because people listening might think she could say whatever she wants, how do we know this is really happening? So I do share some stories in the book, including some publicly with people's names, and so that they've been gracious to share their stories. But I also helped publish a study in 2022, the work of my friend and colleague in Toulouse, France, Dr. Albert Denat, psychiatrist practicing in France for 35 years, now actually more. And he invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with severe chronic mental illnesses. We're talking schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression, who had been in treatment for an average of 10 years, some as long as 30 years.
Resistant, and medications just didn't help.
They were on an average of 5 psychiatric medications at the time they decided to come in and volunteer for his study. And these were patients who had minimal response to years and years of psychotherapy and medications and repeated hospitalizations. They came into the hospital. He gave them a whole foods, mildly ketogenic diet, so low carbohydrate diet, whole foods. And within 3 weeks, 3 of them were not able to stay on the diet long enough to be followed. But those who stayed on the diet for 2 weeks or more, every single one of them improved, and not just a little bit. We're talking 6 to 10 times the degree of response to the diet compared to medications, antidepressant and antipsychotic medications. 43% of them achieved full clinical remission from their primary psychiatric diagnosis.
Even schizophrenia.
Even schizophrenia.
And you know what's really insane is that the medications that we give schizophrenics and treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, are usually antipsychotics or things that make metabolic health more dysregulated.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because this is a really important problem that my patients face every day. For when I've been practicing for 25 years, and the antipsychotic medications, which can be really very important pieces of treatment for people, especially people in dire straits. It can keep people out of the hospital. It can keep people safe from self-injury. It can hold families together, keep people in school. These medicines, when they work, they don't work for most people, but when they work 25, 30% of the time, they can be really life-changing. But at what cost? So the people who do get relief from these medicines pay not just a price in terms of co-pays here in the United States, but also they pay a price in terms of their metabolic health, because these medicines raise insulin and glucose levels within minutes to hours of the first dose. They triple their risk of type 2 diabetes. They shorten their lives by 10 years on average. We're talking cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, it's just to have to make that decision between your mental health and your physical health is a decision that a lot of my patients are struggling with every day.
Psychiatrists must know this, like the traditional psychiatrists, because they often will prescribe a diabetic medication in anticipation for this. But how can they go to bed at night and sleep comfortably? How can they justify this?
I practiced that way for 10 years, and I honestly didn't know there was a better way. And I think that's what it is. I think most psychiatrists don't know that there are alternatives, that there are really powerful nutrition interventions, not just medication interventions, which I'm glad that we have medications that can help reduce insulin resistance and help people reduce their appetite and keep their glucose and insulin levels lower. But why are the glucose and insulin levels high in the first place? It's the huge amount of refined carbohydrate coming into the bloodstream. And if you turn that spigot off, the glucose levels come down and the insulin levels come down. No medications required, right? So if you look at the root cause of those soaring glucose and insulin levels, it's a really powerful intervention. Now, I understand most patients may not want to do this, and a lot of doctors may not have the time or the interest in learning how to do this with patients. I do teach clinicians how to do this, but I think that in most cases, psychiatrists just aren't aware yet of interventions. Yeah.
Now, I have a patient who's got Parkinson's. Is there enough evidence or your clinical experience to say that even Parkinson's can be halted if he gets off the refined food? Because he admits he's a sugar addict.
Yes. So I haven't looked closely at the Parkinson's research for a number of years. When I looked back at it a few years ago in preparation for a presentation, I was giving a conference in Switzerland. I did review the science, and there was a lot of science to support the notion that some of the very same processes that are happening in the background in Alzheimer's disease in terms of energy deficits and proteins misfolding and accumulating and gumming up the brain are happening in Parkinson's just as they're happening in Alzheimer's disease. And I do know that there is some scientific evidence to support the possibility that a ketogenic diet could be useful in Parkinson's. But I also, the little bit that I know about the non-dietary causes of Parkinson's, I also know that there can be some toxins involved in that process as well. So it's certainly not all about diet. But what I learned about Parkinson's several years ago in preparation for that presentation was, as a psychiatrist, I don't treat Parkinson's, but boy, it was eye-opening to see how many similarities there were between Alzheimer's, which I've studied very intensely, and Parkinson's. There were so many parallels.
I'm wondering if we can switch a bit and talk about food addiction for a minute. I know that you are a part of our consensus workshops for the ICD, and I'm hopeful you can speak a little bit about how do you see food addiction being framed? Do you believe in it? And do you think that it requires a diagnostic label? And what would you call it?
Oh my goodness. So yes, I am very proud to be part of that initiative. And I really wish I could be at the conference in London in May, which is going to be amazing. So if anybody out there is listening, please attend if you can. It's going to be wonderful. Do I believe in it? I absolutely do believe in it. And my own personal experience, my years of clinical experience, and my reading of the research. So those three pillars underneath me in terms of supporting that belief. So it's not just a belief. It's a belief that has some support. So there's that. And then do I think it's important to have to have it as a diagnosis? I do. And largely because until it's in print in some sort of official manual, it's not going to officially exist in the minds of clinicians and even in the minds of everyday people who are struggling with this, who are blaming themselves for these behaviors that really make no sense. It can't simply be a matter of willpower. We all know these foods aren't good for us, and yet we can't stop eating them. And it turns out it's not our fault. It turns out that the foods are designed to do this. And one of the things I say in the book is these foods are designed to make you hungrier and to make it feel as though you can't get enough. And those things are signs of an unhealthy relationship. Food should satisfy you. It should nourish you. You should walk away feeling full and energized. You shouldn't walk away feeling empty and wanting more, hopeless and helpless around it, and feeling just absolutely terrible about yourself. All of the same hallmarks of any other addiction. There just is no difference in the behaviors and in the feelings that come along with it, the remorse and this kind of self-blame that go along with these behaviors. So yes, I think it's important for it to be validated as a scientific and clinical construct. And then the other thing you asked was, if I had to pick something, I would think it would be refined carbohydrate addiction. And the reason I say that is because there are other things that essentially are sugar. And a lot of people don't realize that. I know you both realize that. Flour, fruit juice, white rice. These are all just sugar molecules. And they're just different. It doesn't have to be sweet to be sugar. And they're all just as addictive. So I put a little quote in my book from a woman I worked with who was struggling with food addiction. And she said, I don't have problems with sugar. I said, but rice? I could do a face plant in a bowl of rice. Some people are sugar people. Some people are starch people. I'm a starch person. My mom is a starch person. You could lock me in a room full of candy bars. I'd be fine. But starch, a different story. So it's interesting how we're all a little different. But I would call it refined carbohydrate addiction because I think what's happening there is that these naked carbohydrates, they turn instantly into glucose in the bloodstream, and this tsunami of glucose. It's normal for glucose to spike. I hear critics saying, oh, but it's normal. Yes, of course, but not to that degree. And so you've got this unnaturally steep spike in glucose, then you get this unnaturally steep spike in insulin, and then you're off to the races with these peaks and valleys for hours afterward that are throwing up all of your hormones, including your appetite hormones and your stress hormones and your reproductive hormones and your blood pressure regulating hormones and on. Your whole system has become destabilized from within, and you're hungry again in 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah. So you're really tying again the metabolic link with the addiction link. I want to ask you a question. This is a hypothesis that I'm working on. Tell me if this sounds reasonable to you. Could you make the argument that food addiction might be, instead of its own entity, or maybe it still is, that it is yet another manifestation of metabolic disease, like Alzheimer's, like diabetes?
Okay. I need to think deeply about that. And the reason why is I'm thinking about the direction that the arrows are going. Are they going in both directions or just?
Yeah. Right. They're definitely related because you've just said it yourself.
They're absolutely related. Maybe I'm pulling it apart too much in my brain. I haven't thought about this before. Could food addiction be a manifestation of metabolic syndrome? Well, they definitely go hand in hand in a lot of people. So the question is the metabolic syndrome causing people to overeat and be drawn more to these? I guess you could say that.
Because it's an insulin spike in the sugar. Anyway, I'm working on this one. So it sounds like it's a reasonable hypothesis.
No. Oh my gosh, you certainly could. I don't see why you couldn't say that, right? Because what's driving this, what's making you hungry for that hit, that sort of glucose hit and that dopamine hit, are these foods themselves, and is that pattern itself, that metabolic pattern? That's fascinating to think about it that way.
Can I ask you about Ozempic? What's your impression about Ozempic in this context of metabolic syndrome? It's supposed to help metabolic syndrome, and it's supposed to dampen the addictiveness itself, and it makes you not want to eat. So what's your impression about that in the context of this interplay about nutritional and metabolic disease?
There's so many things to say, but maybe the easiest way to respond to that would be to tell a story about a patient. So patient I worked with for 4 years or so now, long, decades-long history of food addiction, and has successfully beaten other types of addiction, including severe alcohol addiction. So a very strong person, a very wise and insightful person who has struggled now for years, even though it's been sober for a very long time from alcohol, still struggles with food addiction and still struggles with obesity and has a lot of metabolic issues like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and things like that. We worked very closely together trying to improve the diet, and he's done an amazing job improving his diet, but still overeats the foods that are on the diet plan, right? Because that behavior is so ingrained from a really significant trauma history and on top of everything else. So after a couple of years of this, he was really struggling to keep his sugars in a healthy range from overeating the right foods, right? So for the most, and yes, it was hard for him to stick to the diet because of these addictive foods, but even when he did stick to it, would overeat. I eventually said to him, you're really struggling. Maybe you want to talk to your doctor about medicine in the Ozempic family to support everything you and I are trying to do, all the good work you're doing around your food. And so he went and talked to somebody, and I think it was Wegovy that he was prescribed as in that family. And these are injectable medications once a week, and they tend to make people sick. So we get the injections, and he was getting sick for a couple of days after each injection. So he didn't like that. But then once the sickness wore off for the other 5 days of the week, it was interesting to observe what happened for him. Because yes, his appetite did go down quite noticeably, which for him was a relief, right?
Yeah.
But what happened was because the food addiction brain kicked in and said, I'm not overeating anymore. I'm eating half a plate of food and I'm stopping. I wonder if I could eat whatever I want. I wonder if I could eat all the foods I haven't been letting myself eat in a controlled fashion.
You said it. This is the food addict brain, isn't it? This is a great story.
Right? And he observed, he's a very intelligent, he's really observed these, wait a minute, this seems a little dangerous. But he indulged as an experiment. Oh, let's see what I can get away with. Maybe I can keep my weight in a healthy range. Appetite's under control. This is great. So all the refined carbohydrates came right back into the picture. And so that was going on for a number of months. The weight started to creep up. The glucose levels, blood sugar levels started to creep up. And he was starting to feel less in control of his health. And the thing that really bothered him, this is a guy that I have a lot of respect for. The thing that really got his attention was, wait a minute, the whole reason I worked so hard to go on this low carbohydrate diet in the first place was to get off insulin injections, which I successfully did. And now I'm on another injection. What am I doing? And so I think he was able then after a few months to say, this is not what I want. I want to be healthy. I want to be healthy. And so he came off the Wegovy. And we are now working together again. We've made some different changes to his diet. He's actually experimenting with a carnivore diet now, which is working better for him than a sort of standard low carbohydrate diet. We're still got some room to go, some work to do. That experience of his taught me so much about the pros and cons of these medications. I'm a pro-choice person. If you want to use medications to treat these conditions, okay, but that's not really going to solve our global mental health or metabolic health crisis, right? We're going to give children these injections? How much money are we going to spend on this? What's causing us to want to overeat like that in the first place? Let's start there.
Yeah, that carnivore diet, he wasn't going to overeat on his state. Like, not really.
He still can, but it's not as detrimental to his
Yes.
health. Yeah.
Because we're getting close to the end, I want to ask you, where do you see the field of metabolic and nutritional psychiatry going, or where would you like to see it go?
To the moon. I really do think that this is the future, so the cutting edge of psychiatric care. And I really do, because the research is exploding in this field. We've got some beautiful studies that have just been published and some more coming out. We've got some wonderful people in the field, scientists, clinicians, grassroots, patient-led efforts, and philanthropists working on this and investing their time and energy and resources in educating and treating and inspiring people about these interventions. This is the first time. It's a pretty exciting time to be a psychiatrist. Our field has really been standing still for decades and nothing
Absolutely.
happened.
The medication's working only to a point, and that's it. And at the same place since the 80s or 90s.
Just a standstill. And the medicines fail most people. And then the medicines have their place and I still use them, but they really fail most people. So we need hope, and we've got it.
And your book is fabulous in explaining that hope.
Thank you. I hope that the book brings hope. I want people to know that dietary changes can help them in ways no medicine can, sometimes in a matter of weeks, but you have to know which dietary changes are the right ones to make. And they're not the ones that we're used to hearing about.
Your book gives those, plus it's very readable. So folks, read this book because it's very readable.
Thank you very much for saying that, Dr. Tarman. And I also recommend that you pair it with Food Junkies. I couldn't include a lot of information I did the best I could to include some information about food addiction in the book because I think it's important. But of course, I didn't write a whole book about it. So please digest that information as well. Put those together.
Yeah, I have to agree. Your book was just so easy to read. It was perfectly laid out, and it's so like step by step, I think, for anyone could pick it up and make big changes in their life, which is so accessible, which it hasn't always been for a lot of people when it comes to mental health help.
Glycerine, that is music to my ears because I honestly did worry. I struggled a lot with how to aim it. So I wanted a lot of science, but I also wanted to be helpful to everyday people. So thank you for saying that. So maybe it's not as challenging as I was worried it was going to be.
No, so far it's the book of the year.
I
Wow.
agree. So what is next for you, Georgia?
Let's see. I'm running a training tonight in about an hour. What's next for me? That really is the big question. One of the blessings of the book has been there have been some new opportunities and ideas that have come my way. And I'm trying to decide how I want to best spend my time. I love teaching. I love teaching clinicians, but I also love teaching the public, just answering questions and helping and get information in the hands of people that need it. So I want to do more of that. But in terms of what my next kind of focused project is going to be, it's more than likely going to end up being either some kind of education or research project, but to be determined.
Okay, so stay tuned is what you're saying.
Yes.
And then we have already asked you our signature question. So I thought I would ask you a different question. And it is, in writing this book, what was your biggest takeaway from the research or some kind of nugget of information where you were like, wow, this is important and people need to know this?
It's funny because I did do a lot of extra research for the book beyond all the research I've been doing for years and years. And so the cutting edge where we don't still know a lot, but I'm terrified to learn more, is about vegetable oils. I think it's just fascinating. I can't wait to see what scientists discover. I've included what I thought was worth including in the book, and hopefully it gives people pause about these supposedly healthy plant-based oils that we're supposed to be replacing all of our animal fats with. But I really am concerned about the level of vegetable oil, and it's virtually impossible to avoid it. It's every restaurant, every packaged food, every hot bar, just everything, baked goods, because we're supposed to not use animal fats anymore in our baked goods. So it's just a little terrifying. And I think there's enough information there to be concerned. And the other thing is that even if we don't have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed yet on the science of how these vegetable oils impact our health, the good news is that there's no earthly reason to consume them in the first place. They're completely unnecessary. They do nothing for you, and they probably are doing quite a bit against you. And so that is something that I didn't know a lot about before I started researching for the book.
That's great and so helpful. And especially when it comes to inflammation, right? Specifically what we're learning.
Yes.
Yeah.
People listening, we've only touched the surface of the content of what this book gives. Nutritional psychiatry, metabolic psychiatry. I really believe it's the future. So it's a must-read book, and it's a really pleasant book to read. Thank you so much, Georgia.
I'm very honored to be here. Thank you so much for all your time and for all your kind words. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.